The island of Java has historically been the main power in the Nusantara archipelago. It was from Java that most of the powerful kingdoms of Nusantara came from and then conquered other parts of the archipelago. Kediri, Singasari, Majapahit, and Demak are some of the most prominent kingdoms in the history of the archipelago, and all of them are Javanese kingdoms. But the island of Java also has other noteworthy non-Javanese kingdoms. Despite the name of the island, Javanese are not only the inhabitants of Java. To the western side of the island, the Sundanese are the dominant power, always resisting the Javanese every time they try to expand to the west. The Sundanese people and the Sunda kingdoms is often overlooked in history books, but they nevertheless just as powerful and historically important as the Java kingdoms. One particularly interesting story is when the Sunda kingdom of Pajajaran made an agreement with the Portuguese, which at the time was a new player in the archipelago and the first ever European. Pajajaran was a Hindu kingdom, but was surrounded by powerful sultanates, in particular with Pajajaran's enemies to the east, the Sultanate of Demak and Cirebon. Not only just in the island of Java, but around the archipelago, Islam is becoming the dominant power, and for the Hindu Pajajaran kingdom, allies were almost non-existent. This is why when the Portuguese seized Malacca in 1511, Pajajaran saw an opportunity to make an ally of the Portuguese to secure its kingdom. The Portuguese first arrived in the archipelago in 1509 when they entered the Strait of Malacca and subsequently traded with the Sultanate of Malacca. The main reason the Portuguese even come to the archipelago in the first place was their search for the notorious Spice Islands. At first, they thought the spices came from India, which they visited a few years prior, only to find out that they were only distributors. The Portuguese then continued to sail east, eventually arriving at Malacca. When they arrived at Malacca, the Portuguese then thought that this was the Spice Islands, because the spice sold at Malacca were more abundant than in India. This is what later prompted the Portuguese to seize the port of Malacca in 1511 under the command of Alfonso de Albuquerque. But later they found out that even Malacca was not the Spice Islands. It was only an entreport. Nevertheless, the Portuguese made Malacca their base of operations in the Nusantara archipelago, continuing to sail east to finally find the Spice Islands. It was from here that the Portuguese began to be involved in the politics of the archipelago, and subsequently the agreement with the Pajajaran kingdom. A year after the Portuguese conquered Malacca, in 1512, King Sri Baduga Maharaja of Pajajaran sent his son, Crown Prince Prabu Surawisesa, to Malacca to offer an agreement with the Portuguese. At the time, the commander of the port of Malacca was Jorge de Albuquerque, the brother of Alfonso de Albuquerque. Jorge agreed to Pajajaran's proposal, which will allow the Portuguese to build a fort at Sunda Kelapa, Pajajaran's port city located at the northwest side of Java, giving the Portuguese a foothold in Java and a much closer stopping point to the Spice Islands of Moluccas. In 1522, Jorge de Albuquerque sent Hendrik de Leme to Sunda Kelapa to finalize the treaty, beginning the alliance between the two. The Portuguese sent many gifts to Pajajaran and was welcomed warmly by the now King Surawisesa at Sunda Kelapa. The treaty was then signed, known as the Luso-Sundanese Padral. This treaty gives the Portuguese access to the trade spices at Sunda Kelapa, as well as constructing a fort there, and in exchange the Portuguese will give military assistance to Pajajaran in combating the Sultanate of Cirebon and Demak. But the treaty was never upheld. After the treaty was signed in 1522, the next year the Portuguese were supposed to come back to Sunda Kelapa to construct the fort, but a rebellion broke out in the Portuguese colony of Goa in India, and they have to send most of their men and resources in Malacca there. Meanwhile, the treaty did not go unnoticed by the sultanates to the east. Cirebon sent a letter to Demak asking them to join forces to attack the port city of Sunda Kelapa. In 1527, the combined forces of Cirebon and Demak attacked and conquered Sunda Kelapa, subsequently cutting off Pajajaran's access to the sea and the trade winds. The Portuguese only came back to Malacca in 1526, and by the time they received the letter from help from Pajajaran, Sunda Kelapa had already fallen. The Portuguese did try to send aid to Pajajaran by sending 6 ships to Sunda Kelapa, which was by then had been renamed Jayakarta. but the aid wasn't successful. One ship was shipwrecked by a storm, and when the remaining 5 arrived at Jayakarta, they find that the port was heavily guarded by the Sultanate's army, armed with many cannons. The Portuguese had no option but to acknowledge the new authority of the port and sailed back to Malacca. When you look at stories of history like this, it's fascinating how the two countries, Portugal and Indonesia, has had contact from this long before. This was around 500 years ago, and we already had contact. Two vastly different nations and cultures from the literal opposite side of the worlds. And that's what's fascinating about history. There's always something hidden, something new to be found in the piles of documents and archives that is rarely seen or even rarely touched by people. And that's up to us. Either we're not historians or not, our passion for history is enough so that we can tell people the amazing history of the world that we have today. Well, that's it from me, and I'll see you next time.